Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the long, dim highways and smoke-filled Union halls of mid-century America, where loyalty was currency and silence meant survival. This is the world of Frank Sheeran, a man shaped by obedience, not impulse, where orders were followed, not questioned, and every job carried consequences that lingered far beyond the moment. Most people couldn't live a life like this, not because of danger alone, but because it demanded burying emotion beneath duty and carrying secrets that never truly fade. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy these slow, reflective journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now dim the lights, let the road noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, heavy story of Frank Sheeran. The old man sat in the wheelchair, staring out the window of the nursing home. His hands, once strong enough to break a man's jaw with a single punch, now trembled slightly as they rested on the armrests. Frank Sheeran was 83 years old, and he had a story to tell. A story that would shake the foundations of American organized crime history. A story about loyalty, violence, friendship, and the kind of secrets that men take to their graves. Except Frank wasn't planning to take his secrets anywhere. He was ready to talk. "I heard you paint houses," the voice had said on the phone all those decades ago. It was code. Everyone in that world knew what it meant. Painting houses meant killing people. The paint was blood, splattered on walls and floors. And Frank Sheeran had painted a lot of houses in his time. More than he could count. More than he wanted to remember. But there was one house he painted that changed everything. One job that would define his life and create one of the greatest mysteries in American criminal history. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how Frank Sheeran became the man who claimed to have killed one of the most powerful labor leaders in American history, we need to go back. Back to the beginning. Back to a cold water flat in Philadelphia where a young Irish-American kid was learning that the world was a hard place, and only the hard survive. Francis Joseph Sheeran was born on October 25, 1920, in Darby, Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. His parents were Irish immigrants, working-class people who'd come to America looking for opportunity and found mostly struggle. His father worked whatever jobs he could find. His mother tried to hold the family together, and young Frank grew up watching them both work themselves to exhaustion just to keep food on the table. The neighborhood where Frank grew up was tough. Irish, Italian, and Polish families packed into tenement buildings. Everyone struggling, everyone fighting for whatever scraps they could get. The kids learned early that you had to be tough to survive. You had to be willing to fight, and Frank Sheeran was more than willing. He was a big kid even as a teenager, tall, strong, with broad shoulders and large hands that seemed made for violence. He got into fights constantly, not because he was particularly mean-spirited, but because that's what you did. Someone looked at you wrong, you fought. Someone disrespected you, you fought. Someone threatened your friends or family, you definitely fought. It was the code of the streets, simple and brutal. But Frank wasn't stupid. He understood that fighting without purpose was just thuggery. He needed direction, needed structure. So when World War II broke out, when America entered the war after Pearl Harbor, 17-year-old Frank Sheeran lied about his age and enlisted in the army. It was 1941, and he was looking for adventure, looking for a way out of the Philadelphia streets, looking for something bigger than neighborhood brawls and dead-end jobs. The army gave him everything he was looking for, and more, much more. Frank was assigned to the 45th Infantry Division, the Thunderbirds. They shipped out to Europe, landed in Sicily in 1943, then fought their way up through Italy and eventually into France and Germany. Frank saw combat, real combat, not street fights where you might get a black eye or a bloody nose, combat where people died, where artillery tore bodies apart, where machine gun fire cut down men like wheat before a scythe. And Frank discovered something about himself in that crucible of violence. He was good at it, very good. He could kill without hesitation, without remorse, without the psychological breakdown that affected so many soldiers. When his officers needed someone to take out a German position, Frank volunteered. When they needed someone for dangerous missions behind enemy lines, Frank stepped up. When they needed someone to do the jobs that other soldiers couldn't stomach, Frank was their man. He participated in some of the bloodiest campaigns of the European theater. The invasion of southern France, the push into Germany, the liberation of concentration camps, which showed Frank horrors he'd never imagined, sights that would stay with him forever. By the time the war ended in 1945, Frank Sheeran had earned a reputation as one of the most effective and ruthless soldiers in his unit. He'd killed dozens of enemy soldiers, maybe more. The exact number didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd discovered his talent. He came home with medals, with commendations, with the kind of military record that should have set him up for a successful civilian life. But the thing about war is that it changes you. The skills that make you valuable in combat don't necessarily translate to peacetime. And Frank found that out quickly. He tried to settle into normal life, got married to a woman named Mary, started a family, took jobs here and there trying to make ends meet. But nothing felt right. The jobs were boring. The routine was suffocating. And Frank carried inside him this capacity for violence, this ability to hurt people without emotional consequence. And in normal society, there was no outlet for that. No place where those skills were valued. Except there was one place, one world where a man who could hurt people efficiently, who could follow orders without question, who had proven in combat that he wouldn't hesitate when things got bloody, was extremely valuable. The world of organized crime. Frank started doing small jobs for local wise guys in the Philadelphia area. Collection work, mostly. When someone owed money and wasn't paying, Frank would show up and convince them to pay. He didn't have to say much. His size, his demeanor, the cold look in his eyes. It was usually enough. And when it wasn't enough, when someone needed a more physical reminder, Frank provided that. 2. He was good at the work. Reliable. Didn't ask questions. Didn't talk too much. Just did what he was told and moved on to the next job. And in the criminal underworld, reliability is currency. Word spread that Frank Sheeran was a guy you could count on. A guy who wouldn't fold under pressure. A guy who, if you needed something serious done, could handle it. By the late 1940s, Frank had developed connections with the Buffalino crime family, a powerful organization based in northeastern Pennsylvania. The family was run by Russell Buffalino, a quiet, unassuming man who wielded enormous power in the underworld. Russell wasn't flashy like some mob bosses. He didn't seek publicity or attention. He operated quietly, running rackets in labor unions, construction, and various other industries. Russell Buffalino saw something in Frank Sheeran. Saw a man who could be useful. Saw a war veteran who understood discipline and hierarchy. Saw someone who could do difficult jobs without creating unnecessary problems. So Russell started giving Frank more work. Better work. Work that paid better and carried more responsibility. Frank became what's known in mob terminology as an associate. He wasn't a made member of the Italian mafia. He couldn't be, since he was Irish and the Italian mob only made Italians. But he was trusted, valued, brought into the circle of people who did the family's business. He worked alongside made members, took orders from capos, and proved himself valuable enough that his ethnic background didn't matter. The work was varied. Sometimes it was labor union business, intimidating workers, disrupting strikes, helping management crack down on union organizing. Sometimes it was collection work, getting money from people who owed debts. Sometimes it was more serious. Sometimes people needed to disappear. Sometimes problems needed to be solved permanently. And Frank handled all of it with the same efficient brutality he'd learned in the war. He developed a reputation, not a public reputation. Frank wasn't famous, wasn't known outside criminal circles. But inside those circles, people knew his name. They knew that Frank Sheeran was Russell Buffalino's guy, that he could be trusted with sensitive work, that he didn't talk, didn't boast, didn't create drama. He just did the job. During this time, Frank was also working legitimate jobs, maintaining a cover of respectability. He drove trucks, worked as a teamster. This was important for two reasons. First, it gave him legitimate income to report, a way to explain where his money came from when tax authorities or law enforcement asked questions. Second, it gave him access to the labor union world, which was deeply intertwined with organized crime in the 1950s. The Teamsters Union, which represented truck drivers and warehouse workers, was particularly corrupt. Mob-connected officials controlled many local chapters. They used union positions to enrich themselves, to extort employers, to provide muscle for various criminal enterprises. And they needed people like Frank, people who could enforce their will, who could make sure that workers fell in line, that employers paid up, that rival union officials got the message. Frank rose through the Teamsters ranks, not because he was a great labor organizer or because he cared about workers' rights, but because Russell Bufalino wanted him there. Because having people positioned in the union gave the mob access, gave them control, gave them opportunities to make money and exert influence. By the mid-1950s, Frank Sheeran had become a fixture in the Philadelphia Teamsters local. He held official positions, attended meetings, represented workers in negotiations. To outsiders, he looked like a legitimate union official. But everyone who mattered knew the truth. Frank was muscle. He was there to make sure things went the way Russell Bufalino and his associates wanted them to go. The union work brought Frank into contact with a wider network of organized crime figures. Teamsters locals across the country were connected to various mob families. The union was a goldmine for criminals. Millions of dollars flowing through pension funds, opportunities for kickbacks and sweetheart contracts, access to legitimate businesses that could be used for money laundering or other schemes. And controlling the union meant controlling a significant portion of the American economy, since trucking was essential to moving goods across the country. Frank traveled frequently for union business, which meant he traveled frequently for mob business. He'd drive to meetings in different cities, carry messages between crime bosses, sometimes handle problems that needed handling in other territories. He became known beyond Philadelphia, beyond the Bufalino family's traditional area of influence. People in New York knew him, people in Chicago knew him, people in Detroit knew him, and it was in Detroit where Frank's life would change forever. Because Detroit was the headquarters of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, and Detroit was where James Riddle Hoffa, Jimmy Hoffa, was building an empire. Jimmy Hoffa was already a legend in labor circles by the time Frank met him in the late 1950s. He'd risen from a warehouse worker to president of the Detroit Teamsters local to a position of enormous power in the International Union. Hoffa was tough, smart, charismatic, and absolutely ruthless when it came to achieving his goals. He wanted to control the Teamsters completely, wanted to turn it into the most powerful labor union in American history. And Hoffa didn't care who he had to work with to achieve that goal. He made deals with organized crime families across the country. He let mob bosses control certain locals in exchange for their support. He used mob muscle to intimidate rivals, to suppress opposition, to enforce discipline. Jimmy Hoffa understood that in the brutal world of labor politics in the 1950s, you needed more than good ideas and passionate speeches. You needed force. You needed fear. You needed people like Frank Sheeran. The introduction came through Russell Bufalino. Russell had connections to Hoffa, had supported him in his rise to power, and when Hoffa needed reliable people in the Philadelphia area, Russell recommended Frank. The first meeting between Frank Sheeran and Jimmy Hoffa was unremarkable on the surface, just two men shaking hands at a union meeting. But it was the beginning of a relationship that would define both their lives. Hoffa liked Frank immediately. He saw the same qualities Russell had seen: reliability, toughness, loyalty. Frank wasn't trying to climb the ladder, wasn't angling for power or attention. He was a soldier, pure and simple. He did what he was told. And Hoffa desperately needed people like that because as he consolidated power, he was making enemies. Lots of enemies. Within the Union, there were factions that opposed Hoffa's methods, that wanted to clean up the corruption, that resented his connections to organized crime. Outside the Union, the federal government was starting to take notice. Robert Kennedy, first as chief counsel for the Senate Rackets Committee and later as Attorney General, had made destroying Hoffa's power his personal mission. Kennedy saw Hoffa as a symbol of everything wrong with labor unions, as a criminal hiding behind the rhetoric of workers' rights. And Kennedy was right, at least partly. Hoffa was absolutely engaged in criminal activity. He was embezzling from union pension funds, taking bribes from employers, using union resources for personal gain. But Hoffa was also, genuinely, a skilled labor negotiator who won real benefits for Teamsters members. He increased wages, improved working conditions, expanded the union's power and influence. To the rank-and-file Teamsters, Hoffa was a hero. To the government and his enemies, he was a gangster in a suit. Frank became one of Hoffa's most trusted enforcers. When Hoffa needed someone dealt with, he called Frank. When there was a problem that required a heavy hand, Frank was the solution. And crucially, when Hoffa needed something done that absolutely could not be traced back to him, Frank was the man he trusted to handle it. The relationship grew beyond business. Hoffa and Frank became genuine friends. They talked for hours about everything: union politics, sports, family, life. Hoffa confided in Frank, shared his frustrations and fears, trusted him with information he wouldn't share with most people. And Frank developed a deep loyalty to Hoffa, the kind of loyalty that went beyond the mob's business relationships. This was different from Frank's relationship with Russell Bufalino. Frank respected Russell, followed his orders, worked for him reliably. But with Hoffa, there was affection. Frank genuinely liked the man, admired him, believed in him even. Hoffa wasn't just a boss. He was a friend, maybe the closest friend Frank had. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Frank's life followed a pattern. He worked for the Teamsters officially, handling union business, representing the Philadelphia local in negotiations and disputes. Simultaneously, he worked for Russell Bufalino and through Bufalino for other crime families, handling whatever jobs came his way. And increasingly, he worked directly for Jimmy Hoffa, serving as a bodyguard, an enforcer, a problem solver. The violence was constant but rarely public. Frank wasn't a showy criminal. He didn't shoot people in crowded restaurants or create dramatic scenes. His work was quiet, efficient. People who needed to disappear would disappear. Problems that needed solving would be solved. And Frank would return to his normal life like nothing had happened. He had a family now, several children with his wife Mary. They lived in a decent house, had what appeared to be a normal middle-class life. The kids went to school. Frank went to work, or at least appeared to. The neighbors had no idea what Frank really did. They knew he was a Teamster, knew he traveled for union business, but they didn't know about the other business. The business conducted in back rooms and dark alleys. The business that left bodies buried in places where they'd never be found. Frank was careful to keep those two worlds separate. At home, he was a father and husband. Maybe not a great one. He was absent a lot, distant even when he was present, carrying the weight of things his family could never know about. But he tried to be normal, tried to give his kids a better life than he'd had growing up in those Philadelphia tenements. The mob world and the family world existed side by side, never quite touching, separated by Frank's ability to compartmentalize. It was a skill he'd learned in the war, the ability to do terrible things and then return to normal life without falling apart. Most people couldn't do it. Most people who saw the things Frank had seen, did the things Frank had done, would break down eventually. But Frank had built walls inside himself, walls that kept the violence contained, kept it from bleeding into the rest of his life. By 1960, Jimmy Hoffa had become president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, the most powerful position in one of America's most powerful unions. It was the culmination of his ambitions, the achievement he'd been working toward his entire career. And Frank was there, part of the inner circle, one of the people Hoffa trusted most in the world. But Hoffa's triumph came with a target on his back. Robert Kennedy, now working for his brother John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign, had made it clear that if the Kennedys won the election, going after Hoffa would be a priority. The government had been investigating Hoffa for years, trying to find evidence of corruption, bribery, embezzlement. So far they'd failed to make anything stick. Hoffa was careful, used intermediaries, kept his direct involvement in criminal activities minimal. But Kennedy was relentless. He believed Hoffa was a cancer on the labor movement, believed that destroying Hoffa's power was essential to cleaning up union corruption. and he had the resources of the federal government behind him. When John Kennedy became president in 1961 and appointed Robert Kennedy as Attorney General, Hoffa knew he was in serious trouble. The Attorney General of the United States was personally dedicated to putting him in prison. That kind of pressure, that kind of sustained law enforcement attention, was nearly impossible to withstand indefinitely. Hoffa fought back. He hired the best lawyers. He used his political connections, calling in favors from politicians he'd supported over the years. He tried to negotiate, to find some accommodation that would get the government off his back. Nothing worked. Kennedy wanted Hoffa destroyed, not compromised with. The pressure affected Hoffa. Frank could see it. His friend was becoming paranoid, stressed, angry in ways he'd never been before. Hoffa started talking about Kennedy in personal terms, about how the Attorney General was making this a vendetta, about how the Kennedys thought they could destroy anyone who stood in their way. And then, in November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. The nation was shocked, traumatized, and Jimmy Hoffa's reaction, at least privately, was something close to relief. With the president dead, would his brother's crusade against Hoffa lose momentum? Didn't. Robert Kennedy, grief-stricken and driven by both his brother's memory and his own convictions, actually intensified the investigation. The Justice Department threw more resources at the Hoffa case. More wiretaps, more surveillance, more pressure on potential witnesses to cooperate. In 1964, Hoffa was finally indicted on charges of jury tampering and fraud. The jury tampering charge stemmed from an earlier trial where Hoffa had allegedly attempted to bribe jurors. The fraud charges involved misuse of Teamsters pension funds. After years of investigation, the government finally had cases they believed they could win. The trials were bitter, contested affairs. Hoffa's lawyers fought every charge, challenged every piece of evidence. But the government's case was strong, built on years of patient investigation and testimony from cooperating witnesses. In 1964, Hoffa was convicted of jury tampering. In 1965, he was convicted of fraud and conspiracy. The sentences were substantial: 8 years for jury tampering, 5 years for fraud, to be served consecutively. 13 years in federal prison. For a man who was in his 50s, who'd spent his entire adult life building power and influence, it was devastating. But Hoffa didn't go to prison immediately. His lawyers appealed the convictions, a process that took years to work through the courts. While the appeals were pending, Hoffa remained free, continued to lead the Teamsters, continued to fight. And Frank continued to work for him, continued to be part of his inner circle, continued to handle whatever needed handling. During this time, Frank's relationship with Russell Bufalino remained strong. Russell was like a second father to Frank in some ways, the mob equivalent of a mentor. Russell taught Frank the subtle arts of organized crime, how to read people, how to avoid unnecessary attention, how to navigate the complex politics of the underworld. Russell was old school, believed in the traditional values of the mafia: respect, loyalty, omerta, the code of silence. Frank's dual loyalty to both Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa created a delicate balance. In the criminal underworld, your primary allegiance was supposed to be to your mob family, to the organization that had brought you in and given you opportunities. But Frank's relationship with Hoffa was different, more personal. It complicated things in ways that would eventually become dangerous. Russell understood the friendship between Frank and Hoffa. He'd encouraged it, in fact, because having someone close to Hoffa was valuable for the Bufalino family and for the mob more generally. The Teamsters Union was too important, too lucrative, for organized crime to lose influence over. And as long as Frank was close to Hoffa, the mob maintained a direct line to one of the most powerful men in American labor. But Russell also understood something that Frank perhaps didn't fully grasp yet. In the mob, no friendship was more important than the organization's interests. If there ever came a time when Jimmy Hoffa's interests conflicted with the mob's interests, Frank would be expected to choose the mob. That was the unspoken rule. That was how the system worked. For now, though, there was no conflict. Hoffa and the mob had a mutually beneficial relationship. Hoffa got muscle and support for his political battles within the union. The mob got access to pension funds, got favorable contracts, got a union leadership that would look the other way when necessary. Everyone was making money. Everyone was happy. Frank continued his work through the mid-1960s, splitting time between Philadelphia, where his family lived, and other cities where business took him. He was on the road constantly, driving trucks sometimes, maintaining his Teamster credentials, attending union meetings, handling problems for Russell, serving as Hoffa's bodyguard and enforcer when needed. The traveling lifestyle was hard on his marriage. Mary Sheeran was raising their children largely alone, never quite sure where Frank was or when he'd be home. She knew he was involved in things he couldn't talk about, knew that the money he brought home didn't all come from driving trucks. But she didn't ask questions. In that world, in that era, wives often didn't ask questions. They accepted what their husbands told them and tried not to think too hard about the rest. Frank's children grew up with a father who was there physically sometimes but emotionally distant most of the time. He'd come home from trips and try to engage with them, try to be a normal dad, but there was always this wall. This sense that part of Frank was somewhere else, thinking about things he could never share, carrying burdens they couldn't understand. One of his daughters later recalled that her father was always watching people, always alert, like he was expecting trouble even at home. He'd sit at the dinner table and his eyes would flick to the door every time there was a noise. He'd position himself where he could see the entrances to whatever room he was in. Little habits, small behaviors that marked him as someone who'd spent too long living in a dangerous world. But Frank tried. He took the kids to church, attended school functions when he could, provided financially, making sure they had a comfortable life. It wasn't the closeness a family should have, but it was something. It was what Frank was capable of giving. Meanwhile, the legal walls were closing in on Jimmy Hoffa. His appeals were working their way through the courts, but the legal experts didn't think he had much chance of overturning the convictions. The evidence was too strong. The witnesses were too credible. Eventually, probably by 1967 or 1968, Hoffa was going to have to report to federal prison to begin serving his 13-year sentence. The prospect of Hoffa going to prison created a power vacuum in the Teamsters. Who would run the union while he was locked up? Hoffa wanted to maintain control, wanted to install a loyal subordinate who would keep the seat warm until he got out. But the government was watching, ready to prosecute anyone who appeared to be acting as Hoffa's puppet. The union politics became vicious. Different factions maneuvered for position. Some officials saw Hoffa's imprisonment as an opportunity to seize power for themselves. Others remained loyal, waiting to see what Hoffa wanted them to do. The mob families that had interests in the Teamsters were also weighing in, backing different candidates, trying to ensure their continued access to the union's resources. Frank found himself in the middle of this political warfare. As one of Hoffa's most trusted people, he was constantly being approached by different factions, each trying to understand where Hoffa stood, what Hoffa wanted, whether Frank would support their particular candidate for leadership. It was exhausting and dangerous. Make the wrong statement, back the wrong person, and you could end up creating powerful enemies. Through all of this, Frank maintained his loyalty to Hoffa. Whatever Hoffa wanted, Frank supported. Whoever Hoffa trusted, Frank worked with. It was simple for Frank. His friend was in trouble, facing prison, fighting to maintain some control over the organization he'd built. Frank's job was to help him however he could. In 1967, Hoffa's legal options finally ran out. The Supreme Court declined to hear his appeal. There were no more delays, no more legal maneuvers. Jimmy Hoffa was ordered to report to federal prison to begin serving his sentence. Before he went in, Hoffa named Frank Fitzsimmons as the acting president of the Teamsters. Fitzsimmons was seen as a Hoffa loyalist, someone who would maintain the status quo and step aside when Hoffa was released. On March 7, 1967, Jimmy Hoffa entered Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania to begin serving his sentence. For Frank, it was like watching a brother go away. He'd been close to Hoffa for nearly a decade. They'd spent countless hours together. They'd trusted each other with secrets that could get them both killed. And now Hoffa was locked up, and Frank was on the outside, tasked with being Hoffa's eyes and ears in the world. Frank visited Hoffa in prison regularly. The visits were social but also functional. Hoffa wanted to know what was happening with the Union, with the various criminal enterprises he was involved in, with the political situation. And Frank would update him, carrying messages back and forth, serving as a conduit between the imprisoned labor leader and the outside world. During one of these visits, Hoffa talked about how much he hated being locked up. Not just the physical confinement, though that was bad enough, but the loss of control, the sense that events were happening without him, that decisions were being made, that his power was slipping away while he sat in a cell unable to do anything about it. Frank tried to reassure him, told him that Fitzsimmons was keeping things running, that the Union was stable, that when Hoffa got out, he'd be able to step right back into leadership. But Frank could see the doubt in Hoffa's eyes, the fear that maybe things wouldn't be the same, that maybe 13 years was too long, that the world would move on without him. And Hoffa's fears weren't unfounded. Frank Fitzsimmons, who was supposed to be a caretaker, started to enjoy the power of being Teamsters president, started making his own decisions, started building his own power base, and crucially, started developing relationships with mob bosses that didn't include Jimmy Hoffa. The mob families that controlled various Teamsters locals began to realize something. Fitzsimmons was easier to work with than Hoffa had been. He was more pliable, more willing to go along with what the mob wanted. Hoffa had been strong, had maintained some independence even while working with organized crime. He'd push back sometimes, would refuse certain requests if he thought they went too far. Fitzsimmons didn't push back. He was happy to cooperate completely in exchange for the mob's support for his presidency. This created a problem. If Hoffa got out of prison and tried to reclaim the Teamsters presidency, it would disrupt the arrangement the mob had with Fitzsimmons. And the mob didn't like disruptions to profitable arrangements. But that was years away. For now, Hoffa was in prison, Fitzsimmons was running the Union, and Frank was trying to navigate the increasingly complex politics of it all while maintaining his loyalty to his imprisoned friend. Russell Buffalino watched these developments carefully. Russell understood the long game. He could see the trajectory, Hoffa locked up, Fitzsimmons gaining power, the mob's interests potentially diverging from Hoffa's interests. And Russell started, very subtly, to position Frank for what might be coming. Nothing explicit. Nothing that Frank would have recognized as preparation for a terrible choice. Just gentle guidance, reminders about where Frank's primary loyalty should lie, about the importance of the organization over any individual friendship. Frank's criminal activities continued through the late 1960s. He still handled enforcement work for Russell, still took care of problems that needed solving. The bodies continued to pile up, buried in locations that investigators would never find, dissolved in ways that left no trace. Frank had become expert at making people disappear. It was a skill he'd refined over 2 decades of mob work. There's a coldness required to do that kind of work repeatedly. You can't allow yourself to think of the victims as people, can't let yourself feel empathy or remorse. Frank had developed that coldness in the war and had maintained it through all his years as a mob enforcer. The people he killed were problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed. Nothing personal, just business. But even with that coldness, even with that ability to compartmentalize, the work took a toll. Frank drank heavily, had for years. Whiskey mostly. It helped him sleep, helped quiet the thoughts that would sometimes surface late at night when he was alone. The faces of people he'd killed, the sounds they'd made, the weight of all those lives he'd ended. He'd never admit it bothered him, would never show weakness like that. But the drinking told its own story. The need for something to dull the edges, to make the memories less sharp, to create enough distance from what he'd done that he could keep doing it. In 1968, Robert Kennedy was assassinated while campaigning for president. The man who'd dedicated years to destroying Jimmy Hoffa was gone, killed by Sirhan in a Los Angeles hotel. When Hoffa heard the news in prison, his reaction was reportedly matter-of-fact. Kennedy had made himself Hoffa's enemy, had pursued him relentlessly. Now Kennedy was dead and Hoffa was still alive. That's just how things worked out sometimes. Frank's reaction to Kennedy's assassination was similarly emotionless. He'd never met Robert Kennedy personally, but he'd hated him on Hoffa's behalf, had seen how the Attorney General's crusade had hurt his friend. Now that enemy was gone. It changed nothing for Hoffa's legal situation, didn't get him out of prison any faster, but at least the man who'd put him there wasn't around to oppose any attempts at early release. By 1970, Jimmy Hoffa had been in prison for 3 years. He was maintaining his spirits, staying physically fit, reading extensively, corresponding with union officials and supporters. But prison was grinding him down in subtle ways. He was approaching 60 years old, and every day locked up was a day he couldn't get back, a day his power eroded a little more. Frank continued his regular visits, bringing news from the outside, carrying messages, providing the connection to the world Hoffa had lost. During one visit, Hoffa started talking about the possibility of getting out early. Maybe a pardon, maybe a commutation of sentence. Richard Nixon was president now, and Nixon had received substantial support from the Teamsters during his campaign. Maybe that support could be converted into clemency for Hoffa. The idea wasn't crazy. Presidential pardons and commutations happened, especially when political favors were owed. The Teamsters Union had delivered votes and money to Nixon's campaign. Surely that was worth something. Hoffa's lawyers were already exploring the possibility, reaching out to contacts in the Nixon administration, trying to find a path to freedom. But there was a complication. Frank Fitzsimmons, now firmly entrenched as Teamsters president, also had connections to the Nixon administration. And Fitzsimmons was making his own arguments that suggested maybe it would be better for everyone if Hoffa stayed in prison a little longer. The union was stable under Fitzsimmons' leadership. Relations with the government had improved. Releasing Hoffa might create instability, might reignite all the conflicts and investigations that had plagued the union before. The mob bosses who'd come to prefer working with Fitzsimmons were also whispering in various ears. Nothing too direct, nothing that could be traced back to them. But the message was getting through to the right people. Hoffa in prison was better for business than Hoffa free and trying to reclaim power. Frank started to sense the shifting dynamics. The way certain mob guys talked about Hoffa had changed. Less respect in their voices. More talk about how things were better now, more stable, more profitable. Frank didn't like it, but he wasn't in a position to do anything about it. He was a soldier, not a boss. He didn't make those kinds of decisions. Russell Bufalino remained one of Hoffa's strongest supporters among the mob bosses. Russell had genuine affection for Hoffa, valued their long relationship. And Russell trusted Frank's judgment about Hoffa's character and loyalty. So Russell used his influence to support the clemency efforts, to argue that Hoffa deserved a chance to get out and that the mob could work with him just as they'd worked with him before. But even Russell was pragmatic. If the majority of mob bosses decided they preferred Fitzsimmons, if they decided that Hoffa's return would be bad for business, Russell would have to accept that. You couldn't fight every battle. Sometimes you had to recognize when the tide had turned and adjust accordingly. In late 1971, after extensive negotiations and political maneuvering, President Nixon granted Jimmy Hoffa executive clemency. But it came with conditions. Hoffa's sentence was commuted, meaning he would be released from prison immediately. But the clemency order included a restriction. Hoffa could not participate in union activities until 1980. He couldn't hold union office, couldn't organize workers, couldn't involve himself in Teamsters business for nearly a decade. On December 23, 1971, Jimmy Hoffa walked out of Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary a free man. Frank was there to meet him. They embraced, two old friends reunited after years of separation. Hoffa looked older, harder. Prison had aged him. But he was free, and that was what mattered. In the car ride away from the prison, Hoffa talked rapidly, excitedly, about his plans. The restriction on union activities was just a piece of paper. He'd find ways around it. He'd work behind the scenes. He'd build support for a comeback. When 1980 arrived and the restriction expired, he'd challenge Fitzsimmons for the Teamsters presidency and take back what was rightfully his. Frank listened and nodded, but inside he felt uneasy. The world had changed in the 4 years Hoffa had been locked up. The power structures had shifted. The alliances were different, and Frank could see things that Hoffa, in his determination and optimism, seemed to be missing. The mob wasn't going to simply welcome Hoffa back with open arms. Fitzsimmons wasn't going to step aside peacefully. This wasn't going to be the triumphant return Hoffa was imagining. But Frank didn't say any of that. He was happy to have his friend back. Happy that Hoffa was free. Whatever problems were coming, they could deal with them as they arose. Hoffa went home to his wife Josephine and tried to adjust to civilian life. But he couldn't stay away from union politics. The restriction in his clemency order said he couldn't participate in union activities. But Hoffa interpreted that narrowly. He could talk to union members socially, couldn't he? He could give advice to friends who happened to be union officials. He could stay informed about what was happening. And what he learned infuriated him. Fitzsimmons had changed policies Hoffa had implemented, had made deals with employers that Hoffa never would have made, had given ground on issues Hoffa had fought hard to win. In Hoffa's view, Fitzsimmons was betraying everything the union stood for, selling out the rank-and-file members in exchange for personal power and the mob's approval. Hoffa started making noise about challenging the clemency restriction. His lawyers argued that the restriction was unconstitutional, that the president didn't have the authority to limit Hoffa's civil rights as a condition of clemency. They filed lawsuits, seeking to have the restriction overturned. Fitzsimmons and his supporters within the union fought back. They argued that Hoffa was violating the clemency terms just by talking about union business, that he should be sent back to prison for breaking the conditions of his release. The conflict became public, bitter, personal, and the mob watched with growing concern. This internal warfare was bad for business. It was creating instability, drawing law enforcement attention, threatening the profitable arrangement they had with Fitzsimmons. Something needed to be done to resolve the situation. Frank found himself caught in the middle. Hoffa expected Frank's loyalty and support. Russell Buffalino expected Frank to be realistic about the situation and to understand that the mob's interests had to come first. And Frank, for perhaps the first time in his criminal career, didn't know which way to turn. He tried to walk a middle path. He stayed in contact with Hoffa, listened to his plans, offered support and friendship. But he also stayed in regular communication with Russell, keeping the mob boss informed about what Hoffa was thinking and planning. Frank told himself he wasn't betraying anyone, that he was just being honest with both sides. But the reality was more complicated than that. By 1974, Hoffa was openly campaigning to return to union leadership. He was meeting with Teamsters locals around the country, giving speeches, building support. The clemency restriction said he couldn't hold office until 1980, but Hoffa was planning to challenge that in court. And if he lost in court, he'd wait until 1980 and then run for president of the International Union. Fitzsimmons and his allies were increasingly worried. If Hoffa managed to return to power, they'd lose everything. Their positions, their influence, their income streams. They couldn't let that happen. And the mob bosses were having the same conversation. Hoffa returning to power would disrupt everything. He was too independent, too strong-willed. He wouldn't be as cooperative as Fitzsimmons. And there was another concern. Hoffa was angry, felt betrayed, might decide that the mob had abandoned him while he was in prison. An angry Hoffa with power was dangerous. He might decide to cut off mob access to the pension funds, might start cooperating with law enforcement to get revenge on people he felt had wronged him. The whispers started. Quiet conversations in back rooms. What if Hoffa didn't make it to 1980? What if the problem solved itself permanently? Frank heard the whispers. At first, he dismissed them. These were just people talking, venting frustration. Nobody was seriously suggesting killing Jimmy Hoffa. He was too high-profile, too well-known. The law enforcement response would be massive. It would bring heat on everyone. But the whispers continued, and they got more specific. Plans were being discussed. Methods were being debated. The mob was seriously considering murdering one of the most famous labor leaders in American history. Frank went to Russell Buffalino, told him what he was hearing, asked if it was real. Russell's response was careful, measured. He didn't confirm anything directly, but he reminded Frank about the importance of loyalty to the family, about how sometimes difficult decisions had to be made for the greater good. about how personal feelings couldn't interfere with business. Frank understood what Russell was really saying. The decision had been made or was close to being made. And when the time came, Frank might be asked to participate. After all, he was close to Hoffa. Hoffa trusted him completely. If someone needed to get close enough to Hoffa to make something happen, Frank was the logical choice. The realization was devastating. Frank had killed many people over the years, had made them disappear without remorse, without hesitation. But those were strangers or near strangers, people who meant nothing to him personally. Jimmy Hoffa was different. Hoffa was his friend, maybe his best friend. The idea of being asked to kill him was almost incomprehensible. But Frank also understood the position he was in. If the mob decided Hoffa had to die, Hoffa was going to die whether Frank participated or not. The only question was whether Frank would be the one to do it, or whether someone else would. And if Frank refused, if he chose friendship over loyalty to the mob, what would happen to him? Would he be seen as a liability? Would he become a target himself? Frank started drinking more heavily. The stress was crushing. He couldn't talk to anyone about it. Couldn't confide in his wife. Couldn't warn Hoffa. Couldn't seek advice from anyone outside the situation. He was completely alone with a terrible knowledge and an even more terrible decision looming in his future. Through early 1975, Frank watched as the situation deteriorated. Jimmy Hoffa was becoming more aggressive in his campaign to return to power. He was giving interviews to newspapers and magazines, talking openly about how Fitzsimmons had betrayed the union, how the Teamsters needed real leadership again. He was meeting with rank-and-file members, promising that when he returned, things would change. He'd clean up the corruption, restore the union to its former strength. The irony wasn't lost on Frank. Hoffa talking about cleaning up corruption when he'd been deeply involved in criminal activities himself. But Hoffa seemed to genuinely believe he could somehow separate the good parts of his leadership from the criminal parts, could return as a hero without acknowledging his own role in the problems he was now criticizing. Fitzsimmons responded by consolidating his own power. He made sure his supporters controlled key positions in the union. He strengthened his relationships with mob bosses, assuring them that he would continue to be cooperative, continue to allow them access to pension funds and other resources. He was building an alliance against Hoffa that included both legitimate union officials and organized crime figures. Russell Bufalino called Frank to a meeting in the spring of 1975. They met at a restaurant in Pennsylvania, a place where they could talk privately. Russell ordered for both of them, made small talk about family and business, the kind of casual conversation that preceded serious discussions. Then Russell got to the point. "Your friend Jimmy is creating problems," Russell said quietly. "He's not listening to reason. He's pushing when he should be backing off. People are getting nervous." Frank knew what Russell meant by people getting nervous. The mob bosses had made their decision, or were very close to making it. Hoffa had become a liability that needed to be eliminated. "Maybe I could talk to him," Frank offered. "Get him to calm down, be more patient. Wait until 1980 when the restriction expires legally." Russell shook his head. "It's beyond that now. Jimmy's not going to listen. He thinks he can fight everyone and win. He's wrong." There was a long silence. Frank stared at his plate, unable to eat. Russell watched him with something that might have been sympathy. "If it has to be done," Russell said carefully, "it should be done by someone he trusts. Someone who can get close without making him suspicious. You understand?" Frank understood perfectly. He was being told that when the order came down to kill Jimmy Hoffa, he would be expected to participate. Probably to be the primary actor, since he was one of the few people Hoffa would meet with alone, without guards or witnesses. "I need time," Frank said. "Time to think." "There isn't much time," Russell replied. "Things are moving. Decisions are being made. You're going to have to choose where your loyalty lies." Frank knew Russell was right. The walls were closing in. The mob had decided Hoffa was too dangerous to leave alive. And once that decision was made, there was no appealing it, no negotiating around it. Hoffa was going to be killed. The only question was who would do it and when. Over the next few weeks, Frank continued his regular contact with Hoffa, meeting for meals, talking on the phone, listening to Hoffa's plans and frustrations. And every time they talked, Frank felt the weight of what was coming. He was spending time with a man who had no idea that his closest associates were planning his murder. Hoffa seemed to sense something was wrong. During one conversation, he looked at Frank carefully and said, "You seem distant lately. Everything okay?" Frank forced a smile. "Just tired. A lot going on." "You'd tell me if something was wrong, wouldn't you?" Hoffa asked. "If you heard anything I should know about?" It was a direct question, a chance for Frank to warn his friend, to tell him that his life was in danger, that he needed to disappear, to go into hiding, to do something to save himself. Frank looked at Jimmy Hoffa, this man he'd known for nearly 20 years, this friend who trusted him completely, and he lied. "Everything's fine, Jimmy. Nothing to worry about." The guilt of that moment would stay with Frank for the rest of his life. But in that instant, he'd made his choice. Loyalty to the mob over loyalty to his friend. The organization over the individual. Survival over conscience. In late July 1975, things started moving quickly. Frank received word through Russell that a meeting was being arranged. Hoffa was going to meet with some people to discuss his return to union leadership. The meeting was scheduled for July 30th at a restaurant in Detroit. Hoffa was told that Anthony Provenzano, a powerful Teamsters official from New Jersey with deep mob connections, would be there, along with Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mob figure. Both men were people Hoffa had relationships with, people he would trust enough to meet. Frank was told he needed to be in Detroit. He would pick up Hoffa, drive him to the meeting location. Everything would be arranged. All Frank had to do was get Hoffa there. The plan was presented to Frank matter-of-factly, as if it were just another job. But Frank understood what this really was. He was being asked to deliver his friend to his execution, to be the Judas who brought him to the people who would kill him. Frank could have refused, could have warned Hoffa, could have done something different, but he didn't. He'd already made his choice weeks earlier when he'd lied to Hoffa about everything being fine. Now he was just following through on that choice. On the morning of July 30th, 1975, Frank was in Detroit. The day was hot, humid, typical summer weather for Michigan. Frank was staying at a house owned by mob associates, preparing for what was coming. He was drinking to steady his nerves, trying not to think too hard about what he was about to do. The plan was simple. Hoffa would go to the Machu's Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a suburb of Detroit, expecting to meet Provenzano and Giacalone. When he arrived, he'd find that they weren't there. Yet, he'd wait. And while he was waiting, Frank and others would pick him up, tell him there was a change of plans, the meeting was happening somewhere else. Hoffa would get in the car with Frank, someone he trusted completely, and they'd drive him to a house where he would be killed. That afternoon, Jimmy Hoffa drove himself to the Red Fox restaurant. He arrived around 2:30 p.m., parked his car, and waited for the meeting that would never happen. Provenzano wasn't coming. Giacalone wasn't coming. The meeting had never been real. It was just bait to get Hoffa to a specific place at a specific time. According to what Frank Sheeran would later claim, he and others arrived at the restaurant a short time later. They told Hoffa there was a change of plans, that they needed to go to a house nearby where the real meeting would take place. Hoffa, trusting Frank completely, got into the car without suspicion. They drove to a house in the Detroit area. Hoffa was still talking about union business, about his plans for returning to power, completely unaware of what was about to happen. When they arrived at the house, Hoffa got out of the car and walked inside, still expecting a meeting. What happened next, according to Frank's later confession, was quick. They went into the house. Hoffa realized too late that something was wrong, that this wasn't a meeting, that he'd been set up. Frank Sheeran, the man Hoffa had trusted for 20 years, the friend he'd confided in and relied on, pulled out a gun and shot Jimmy Hoffa twice in the head. Hoffa died instantly. The man who'd built one of the most powerful labor unions in American history, who'd stood up to the Kennedy brothers, who'd survived years in federal prison, was killed by someone he considered a friend in a suburban Detroit house on a hot July afternoon. Frank would later describe the moment in chilling terms. He said Hoffa looked at him just before he pulled the trigger, and there was this moment of recognition, of betrayal, of understanding. Hoffa knew in that last instant what was happening and who was doing it. After the shooting, Frank and the others disposed of the body. The exact details of what they did with Hoffa's remains have never been definitively established. Frank gave different versions over the years. Some accounts say the body was cremated. Others say it was buried. Still others suggest it was taken to a mob-connected disposal site. The truth is that Jimmy Hoffa's body has never been found, despite decades of investigation and numerous searches based on various tips and theories. Frank left Detroit that same day, flew back to Philadelphia like nothing had happened. He was back in his normal routine within 24 hours, back to his regular life, back to his family. And he said nothing to anyone about what he'd done. Jimmy Hoffa was reported missing when he didn't return home that evening. His car was found at the Red Fox restaurant, locked and empty. There were no signs of struggle, no witnesses to an abduction, no evidence of what had happened to him. He had simply vanished. The investigation began immediately. The FBI knew this wasn't a normal missing person case. Jimmy Hoffa didn't just disappear. He was either dead or being held somewhere, and given his prominence and his enemies, murder was the most likely explanation. But without a body, without witnesses, without physical evidence, the case was nearly impossible to solve. Investigators talked to everyone who'd been in contact with Hoffa in his final days. They interviewed Frank Sheeran multiple times. Frank told them he'd been in Philadelphia on July 30th, had nothing to do with Hoffa's disappearance, didn't know anything about what had happened. He passed a polygraph test, or at least the results were inconclusive. There was no evidence connecting him to the crime. The disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa became one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history. Theories proliferated. Books were written. Television shows dedicated episodes to exploring what might have happened. The FBI received thousands of tips, investigated hundreds of leads, dug up fields and demolished buildings based on rumors about where the body might be buried. They found nothing. And through it all, Frank Sheeran maintained his silence. He went about his life, continued his work for the mob, acted like he knew nothing about Hoffa's fate. But inside, something had broken. The guilt, the weight of what he'd done, started eating away at him in ways that decades of other killings never had. Frank had killed many people over the years. Strangers, mostly. People who meant nothing to him. Those deaths didn't haunt him. But Jimmy Hoffa was different. Hoffa had been his friend, had trusted him, had never done anything to Frank personally except be loyal and generous. And Frank had murdered him, not because Hoffa deserved it, not because of any personal grievance, but simply because the mob had ordered it. The drinking got worse. Frank was consuming a bottle of whiskey or more every day, trying to drown the memories, trying to forget the look on Hoffa's face in that last moment. His marriage deteriorated further. His relationship with his children became even more distant. He was physically present but emotionally absent, a shell of a person going through the motions of normal life while carrying a secret that was destroying him from the inside. Russell Bufalino never directly acknowledged Frank's role in Hoffa's death, but their relationship changed after July 1975. Russell treated Frank with a new level of respect, the kind of respect reserved for people who'd proven their absolute loyalty even when it cost them dearly. Frank had been tested in the most extreme way possible and had passed the test. He'd chosen the mob over his closest friend. The years went by. The 1970s turned into the 1980s. Frank got older, his health declined, but he continued doing work for the mob when called upon. The violence of his younger years gradually decreased as he aged out of the heavy work. But he remained connected, remained part of the organization that had defined his entire adult life. In 1980, Russell Bufalino was convicted on extortion charges and sentenced to prison. The man who'd been Frank's mentor, his connection to the mob hierarchy, his protector in many ways, was locked up. Frank visited him in prison the same way he'd once visited Hoffa. The irony wasn't lost on him. Frank's wife Mary died in the early 1990s. They'd been married for decades, had raised children together, but Frank had never been able to fully let her into his real life, never been able to share the truth about what he did and who he was. She died probably never knowing that her husband had killed Jimmy Hoffa, though she certainly knew he'd been involved in terrible things. By the mid-1990s, Frank was in his 70s and his health was failing. Heart problems, the same issues that had plagued him for years, were getting worse. He'd had multiple heart attacks, was on various medications, was slowing down in all the ways old men slow down. And he started thinking about mortality, about what would happen when he died, about what kind of legacy he'd leave. He'd lived his entire life by the code of omerta, the mafia's code of silence. Never talk to law enforcement, never admit to crimes, never betray the organization. It was the fundamental rule, the one thing that made the mob function. And Frank had honored that code his entire life, through arrests and interrogations and pressure from investigators. He'd never broken, but now, facing the end of his life, Frank started reconsidering. What was the point of maintaining silence anymore? Most of the people he'd worked with were dead or in prison. The mob itself had changed, had become something different from what it was in his era. The old rules didn't seem to mean as much, and there was the burden of the Hoffa secret. For more than 20 years, Frank had carried the knowledge of what really happened to Jimmy Hoffa. The question had tormented investigators, fascinated the public, spawned countless theories. And Frank knew the truth. He'd been there. He'd done it. In the early 2000s, Frank was approached by a former prosecutor named Charles Brandt. Brandt was writing a book about organized crime and had heard rumors that Frank Sheeran might have been involved in Hoffa's disappearance. He reached out to Frank, not expecting much, just hoping for maybe some background information. What happened instead was that Frank, after decades of silence, decided to confess, to tell the whole story, to admit what he'd done. The confessions came slowly, over multiple meetings. Brandt would visit Frank at his home or at the nursing facility where he was living, and Frank would talk about his life in the mob, about the murders he'd committed, about his relationship with Russell Bufalino and Jimmy Hoffa, and eventually, about what really happened on July 30th, 1975. Frank told Brandt that he'd been the one who killed Jimmy Hoffa. He described the planning, the setup, the drive to the house, the moment he pulled the trigger. He provided details that only someone who was actually there would know. He admitted that he'd betrayed his friend on orders from the mob, and that the guilt had haunted him ever since. Brandt's book, I Heard You Paint Houses, was published in 2004. Created a sensation. Here, finally, was a first-hand account of what had happened to Jimmy Hoffa, told by the man who claimed to have killed him. The FBI investigated Frank's claims, tried to verify the details, but without physical evidence, without Hoffa's body, they couldn't definitively prove or disprove the confession. Some investigators believed Frank. The story fit with what they knew about mob operations, about the people involved, about the timeline of events. Others were skeptical, thought maybe Frank was exaggerating his role or taking credit for something he hadn't actually done. The debate continues to this day. Frank Sheeran died on December 14, 2003, just before the book about his life was published. He was 83 years old. He died in a nursing home, surrounded by some of his children, who'd finally heard the truth about what their father had been. His final years had been spent in confession, in trying to unburden himself of the secrets he'd carried. Whether that provided him any peace is unclear. His daughter Dolores later said that her father seemed both relieved to finally tell the truth and devastated by having to relive what he'd done. The story of Frank Sheeran is the story of a man who chose loyalty to a corrupt organization over every other value, who sacrificed friendship, family, conscience, all in service to the mob. He'd been a soldier his entire life, first in the army, then in the Teamsters, then in organized crime. He'd followed orders, done what he was told, never questioned the commands he received, and it had cost him everything. His soul, if you believe in such things, his peace of mind, his relationships with the people who should have mattered most. In the end, Frank Sheeran died alone with his guilt, having confessed to crimes that destroyed countless lives, including his own. The mystery of Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance remains officially unsolved. Despite Frank's confession, Despite decades of investigation, Hoffa's body has never been found. The FBI continues to receive tips and occasionally investigates new leads. But after nearly 50 years, the likelihood of finding physical evidence grows smaller with each passing year. Frank's confession provided answers, but also raised new questions. Was he telling the complete truth? Were there details he left out or changed? Did he act alone, or were there others involved who've never been identified? We may never know for certain. What we do know is that Frank Sheeran lived a life of violence in service to organized crime. He killed many people, destroyed families, contributed to the corruption and brutality that define the mob's operations. His confession at the end of his life doesn't redeem those actions, doesn't erase the harm he caused. But it does provide a window into that world, into the mentality of men who chose that life and lived by its brutal rules. Frank Sheeran wasn't a hero. He wasn't even an anti-hero in the romantic sense. He was a killer who followed orders and lived with the consequences, and his story is a reminder of the human cost of organized crime. Not just for the victims, but for the perpetrators who carry the weight of their actions until the day they die. In 2019, director Martin Scorsese made a film based on Brandt's book, titled The Irishman. Robert De Niro played Frank Sheeran, Al Pacino played Jimmy Hoffa, and Joe Pesci played Russell Bufalino. The film brought Frank's story to a massive audience, sparked new interest in the Hoffa case, and reignited debates about what really happened that July day in 1975. Frank Sheeran's legacy is complicated. He was a murderer, a criminal, a man who betrayed his closest friend. But his confession also provided closure of a sort, gave investigators and Hoffa's family at least one version of the truth after decades of uncertainty. Whether that confession was an act of conscience or just an old man's final attempt to matter, to be remembered, is something each person has to decide for themselves. What's certain is that Frank Sheeran lived a life that embodied the darkness at the heart of organized crime. The violence, the betrayal, the sacrifice of everything decent in pursuit of loyalty to something fundamentally corrupt. His story is a cautionary tale about the choices we make, the loyalties we honor, and the price we pay for living outside the boundaries of law and conscience. Frank Sheeran painted many houses during his life, and in the end, that paint, that blood covered him too, stained him in ways that could never be washed clean, marked him as a man who'd chosen wrong and spent the rest of his life trying to live with that choice. He died as he'd lived, haunted by violence, isolated by secrets, destroyed by the very loyalty he'd prized above all else.